Thank you for coming to my talk. So today we're going to be talking about decentralized DAOs, insights from off-chain dynamics. So for this talk, hello, yep. So for this talk, we'll talk about DAOs, protocols, communities in Web3, and we'll use them interchangeably. And then we'll analyze some qualitative data as well as quantitative data. We'll try to create some insights from that data and enable you to draw your own insights eventually. Okay, so a little bit about me. I'm David, founder of x23.ai. I'll talk a bit about that a bit later. Previously, I was at the Aave Genesis team back in 2020 and also with Coinbase in 2015. I've also been a part of a few DAOs, both like venture angel DAOs, but also I'm a reviewer on the Aave Grants DAO as well. So, talking about definitions of DAOs and what exactly are DAOs. So a lot of people have heard about them, but there's no real, I guess, agreement, even in this room, on what exactly are DAOs. So for those that don't know, DAOs stand for decentralized, but most of the time they're not decentralized. Autonomous, a lot of times they're not autonomous. Or organized, but a lot of times they're definitely not organized. And it can be a little bit like this picture, where it's just a bunch of people arguing about, like very passionately arguing about certain topics, and then a lot of their friends are either watching or participating. But that's a good DAO if you have like high participation rate, right? Because that's sort of what you want. Whereas sometimes other DAOs can be just like a bunch of people hopping on the train, either airdrop farming, and they're just speculators, or they're just watching. And that's generally what you don't want, depending on I guess, the size of the DAO, especially if they're just, looking for airdrops or to be leeches to your organization. And at worst, they're just echo chambers in that, you make a proposal and everyone will just agree with you. So that's sort of what we don't want. So our goal for this talk is that how do we differentiate between these, let's call them DAOs, but when I say DAOs, I mean communities and sort of online communities, organizations. How do we differentiate the different types? So let's say the active or healthy DAOs. How do we define that? Well, we need to look into the data, right? But what sort of data should we look into? So there's price data, right? But price data doesn't really indicate anything because traders will be trading, and you can see from these sort of dead projects that they still have a lot of market value. So price data doesn't really mean much in terms of the health of DAOs. We can look at social media activity, but as you know, there's like bots, and bots will be spamming. You can see all the hashtags here. So we can't rely on social media activity either. Voting activity is a bit better. So a lot of on-chain DAOs that have voting activity. So you can see here, there's Uniswap. There's about nearly 400,000 holders. And of those holders that actually vote, there's about more than 40,000 voters. So that's about 10% of holders. And that's pretty good, right? So that indicates a relatively healthy DAO that's participating, that has high participation rate. And then the other piece of data that could be useful is forum activity. So the good thing about forum activity, it's quite qualitative, but also we get pseudo-identities. So we can see who are the contributors to the DAO, right? We're not just like faceless people, and we can see like what's important topics and things like that that's happening in the DAOs. So what sort of data should we look at? We should look at qualitative data, that's forum data, quantitative data, votes, also historic data over time so we can compare, and then across Web3 so we can compare all these different DAOs so we can see what's healthy and what's not. Okay, so X23, that's my startup. So what do? We crunch the data. Essentially, we uncover what's happening across Web3 by aggregating, condensing, and then prioritizing all this data to help you make better decisions. So we've indexed about nearly 30 protocols now, or 30 DAOs, across forum discussions, snapshots, GitHub pull requests, GitHub repositories. Eventually, will be on-chain data and also like social data. We have about more than 50,000 pieces of content now that we've indexed. And then recently we created this product called Community Rankings. So it's sort of like, let's say, DeFi Llama or CoinGecko, but for the health of communities. So I have rankings, all time, weekly, and things like that. And so I'll use that as a basis for this talk to dive into the data. So what can we learn from voting and forum activity? A few things, right? So I'll go through like categories, what is being talked about, active topics, like what are there more discussions? Is it stagnating? Is it growing? Is it same or less? Who are the contributors, right? Who's contributing what percentage? Is it just one person posting everything? Or like, lots of people posting? And voting dynamics. So are there dissenting opinions, or is it just an echo chamber? Are things passing super easily, or is there a lot of friction in these proposals passing? And I'll explain what those means and the insights we can get from them. Yeah. All right. So categories. If we look at categories of all time, we can see that categories meaning like tags. So what we did with this data, we crunched all this data, then we pulled out the category tags of like, okay, what are people actually talking about on these forums? So number one here, you can see this is for all time. So MakerDAO is the most active DAO. Then it goes Ethereum, Aave, Balancer, ENS, Gitcoin. So these are the types of categories that have been talked about all time, right? So MakerDAO, stablecoin, that makes sense because they're a stablecoin. Ethereum, developer tooling, that makes sense. It's a developer tool. Aave, lending, yep, that's pretty good. Balancer, DeFi, Balancer's a AMM, but they don't really talk about the AMM part because they're a bit more than that. All right, so they're talking about DeFi, which is interesting. ENS, identity, which makes sense, and then Gitcoin, grants and funding. So that's interesting. We can get insights on what's being talked about all the time. But if we also compare all time with, let's say, weekly, we can see how it changes, right? So this was, I think, 2 weeks ago, actually. We can see that the tags changed. So there was a new one in MakerDAO, which was vote. So that means for that week, an important tag came up, which was there was an important vote that was happening. With Ethereum for that week, there was less talk about developer tooling and more talk about controversial things, because there's a controversial EIP that was submitted and talked about. For Aave, there was the same categories. You can make your own insights from that. I think it's that the Aave community really talks about the same things. They're quite focused. Balancer community talked about funding, and I think that was in regards to providing funding to projects to build on top of Balancer. ENS, they talked less about events and more about developer tooling, because ENS started to, I guess, pivot in this direction of, trying to bring on more developers to build upon the ENS protocol. And then Gitcoin is interesting that they added social impact. So if you've been keeping up to date, you can see that Gitcoin is like having this pivot into social impact. So those are some interesting insights we can get from just looking at the categories and how they evolve over time. Right? If we look at the topic discussions over time, in the same way, we can see that we're ranking them from the activity. So how many topics were created. And you can see for all time, MakerDAO was number 1. But then for weekly, MakerDAO went to number 4. Right? But then you see Ethereum and Aave remained both 2 and 3. And then we had Optimism come up. Right? So it's interesting to see, like, okay, MakerDAO from all time, MakerDAO has the most topics. But in the last week, it's still active, but it went down quite a bit. And what caused that drop in rankings? So if we graph the activity over time, we can see that, hey, there's a peak, and then now it's sort of going down. So what does that mean? Does that mean like MakerDAO is stagnating as a community? Does that mean like less people contributing or not? Well, we don't know until we compare to other communities. So what we can do is we can look at, let's say, Aave. You can see that there's a spike, but it's trending up. If we look at Ethereum, we can see Ethereum, it's trending up. And if we overlay all of them on top of each other, we can see that from this graph, one interpretation would be that MakerDAO is, the discussions at least are stagnating, or that they're going more offline, right? Because their MakerDAO is like sort of restructuring its entire community, and they have all these secret projects, so maybe things are being less publicly collaborative, whereas both Ethereum and Aave are increasing or trending up. So another one we can look at is Optimism, which sort of burst onto the charts at number 5. We can look at the topics over time, but it's interesting if we compare Optimism topics over time, and they are the yellow line here. So you can see that sort of they burst onto the scene, and they're sort of pretty consistent, or almost the same as like Aave and Ethereum. So this indicates to me this is what a healthy community looks like. Like there's tons of activity. Ethereum and Aave took a long time to reach that sort of level of activity, and Aave sort of burst on and Optimism burst on the scene, and they're quite active. So that's interesting, especially comparative to what's happening at MakerDAO. All right, so we can also look at the authors and contributors. Right, so if we look at the author-contributor rankings, that's the middle one here. We won't go through all of them, but we can focus on just 3 of the protocols: Aave, Optimism, and the graph. So we can see that. Basically what we do with the data is that we count how many contributors made topics, and then we can see who made the most topics of that community. So of Aave, Chaos Labs made 129 posts out of 1,500 posts. So that's about 8.4% of the topics created over all time was by Chaos Labs. Right, but we don't actually know what that means. Like, there's no insights from that until we compare with other communities. So if we compare with Optimism, the system account, which is their official account, they did about 12% of the posts. And then with the graph, there's Oliver, who did 4.76% of the posts. So what does that mean? Does that mean that the graph is more decentralized or more healthy than Aave? Because, you know, Oliver's making sort of half the, he's the top poster in the graph, but he's making half the post that Chaos Labs is making. We could make that insight that maybe the graph is more decentralized because, you know, more people are contributing to discussions. But we also have this other column here, which is the voting trends. So if we compare the voting trends with the contributors, it becomes quite interesting because we can see that Aave is quite controversial. And the way we measure how controversial the voting trends are is essentially how the difference between voting, like how people vote in proposals. Whereas the graph, it's quite unanimous, right? So what does that mean exactly? What are some specific examples? Well, here's an Aave proposal. We can see here that it's like nearly 50% voted yes and nearly 40% voted no, right? So that's a pretty split community. For this other controversial proposal, is also 55% and 45%, right? So that's pretty split. Now, if we compare that to the graph proposals, what does the graph look like? Well, it's like 99.72% voted yes, right? And another proposal, they have another 99.93%, right? So it's quite unanimous when you compare the graph and Aave. So what does that mean? Like, which is more decentralized? You know, which has more broad community involvement? Which community is more aligned? What's healthier for community protocol DAO? Like, I don't mean to like dive too much into the graph. I know, like, from a technical perspective, they're quite decentralized, but from a community perspective, it looks like they're not as decentralized. They're quite unanimous, right? Whether what's healthy or what's not, it probably depends on what you're trying to build and stuff. I think it's interesting insights for you to draw. Anyway. But of course, I have to mention that authors and contributors can fluctuate over time as well as the voting trends. So we can see this is the monthly voting trends. It was controversial, and then, Arbitrum was quite controversial, but Aave wasn't as controversial. It was just contentious, right? So if we change the, like, between week to week or month to month or how many proposals are being submitted, it can become more controversial or less controversial. But it's always interesting to look over time. Okay, so going back to our goal of how do we determine or differentiate between these different DAOs, we look at the data and the qualitative data that I mentioned as well as quantitative data. The disclaimer here is that different DAOs have different cultures, as I mentioned. What works for one DAO may not work for the others. You know, MakerDAO has a specific culture, the Graph has a specific culture, and Aave has a specific culture. It really depends what you want to align with. If you want to align with something that has a lot of different contributors, you can sort of see what DAO sort of fosters that. Or if you want something that has like a very strong alignment with the founding team, you know, maybe something like the Graph or other DAOs would be more similar. So the community rankings, it's like a free app that you can just go on the website. Yeah, you can check it out and make your own insights from that if you want. That's the end of my talk. So I think we can grab some questions now if you guys have. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I know we did a little bit of questions earlier, but we still have a bit of time. If we can have the lights up so we can see everyone's beautiful faces. Lovely, lovely. Question?
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. Are you looking at the repartition of the voting power? Because typically, like, you know, if 5 people can vote for like 80% of the DAO, might, you know, leads to some result.
Not yet. But what we do is we're looking at the volume of votes. So we can see, you know, if someone's delegated a lot of votes to someone else, we can see that. That's why we get like 50. If it's a 50-50 result, that means it's quite controversial, right? Yeah.
Hi, thanks for the talk. It was great. So I think the data that you have is fantastic. It's really interesting to look at. Just to push back maybe a bit on the conclusions. Like recently, I've talked to many people and kind of come to the conclusion that often increase in activity is actually not a good sign for a DAO. So it very much depends. I think I'll qualify that by what the DAO wants to achieve. but more activity means that often it becomes more confusing for outsiders, and you get these kind of inside cabals that basically make the decision. It's very hard for anyone from the outside to get through the noise, get what's going on. And especially for DeFi DAOs, I think that's the case, where probably you don't want many votes. You just want to vote on very fundamental things to get the broader community involved, but you kind of want expert decision-making largely. Did you have a view on that, or would you agree, disagree?
It's a very good point.
Interested in your perspective.
I think overall, I strongly agree. Around there's like too much activity and it becomes cumbersome, and that's why I created like X23, a little shield of x23.ai. So we help solve information overload, right? So essentially we use AI, large language models, to essentially condense all that information to make it more easily accessible. So that's why we can do this sort of data. So it's like even if a community is posting like I agree, and you have all this spam content, we can filter that out. So we can actually just draw out the actual proper like actual real discussions, right? So that's what we're measuring here. So I disagree that more activity is bad for the health of the community, but I agree that more activity becomes harder for people to get onboarded to the DAOs, and that's a problem we're trying to solve with X23, is to make it less, overwhelming. And then you can do we have a search interface as well. So if you're only interested of like grants for Gitcoin, you can search for that. Or if you're only interested in, I don't know, risk parameters at Aave, we can just draw that information out. Yeah.
All right, we got time for one more question.
Okay, yeah, great talk, thanks. Being it's such a new field, so there's no scientific balance yet, probably. So I'm curious, are you aware of scientists investigating DAOs and getting to definitions? And are you planning to integrate those definitions or into your protocol? Because on the technical, social side, there's so much to discover, and it seems that you're generating it now from the data, but on the definition side, I would say there's also a lot to gain.
Yeah, I mean, like we had in the early discussion, around definitions, I think I'm not really from academia, and I think academia and regulators are always lagging, for us in this room that are on the bleeding edge. But I do have some academics that use our data in their PhD thesis and things like that. So I think over the next year or two, you will start seeing more academic definitions, because they're aware of this. So they will make their definitions, but there's no central regulated body that says this is what DAOs are meant to be and things like that. But yeah, I encourage academics to come in and study this stuff. There's a lot of interesting things, a lot of interesting insights they can pull out. I think there's new organizational mechanisms that can be applied to traditional companies as well, around participation. But yeah, good
Awesome.
question.
Thank you so much, David. And if you have further questions, please ask him outside, because I'm sure he'd be more than happy to talk to you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.